The rain was cold, the kind that soaks through wool and finds the bones. Alaric stood in the mud outside the Porta Salaria, the northern gate of Rome, and watched his Visigoths shiver. They had been camped here for weeks. They were not here to conquer, not yet. They were here to collect. 8 years, that's how long Alaric had served Rome. 8 years of his warriors fighting the empire's battles along the Danube, in Greece, in Italy itself. The price for that service had been agreed upon, 4,000 pounds of gold, a king's ransom, yes, but a bargain for the security of an empire. The gold was the promise that kept his people fed, armed, and loyal. It was the contract. The letter in his hand was the answer. It had come from Ravenna, the new imperial capital, a swamp fortress 100 miles to the north where the young Emperor Honorius hid behind his marshes and his palace walls. The parchment was fine, the script elegant. The message was simple: no. No gold, no negotiation, no recognition of the debt. The emperor's chief minister, a man named Olympius, had convinced the court that the barbarian could be ignored, that the promise could be broken. Think of that feeling, the gut punch of being told after the work is done that the check isn't coming. For Alaric, it wasn't a paycheck. It was the survival of 20,000 men, women, and children camped in the November chill. He looked past the crumpled parchment to the walls. They were not the gray, grim battlements of a frontier fort. They were a marvel, 30 feet high, 19 kilometers long, a circuit of brick and stone that had not been breached in 800 years. Behind them lay a city of 1 million souls, streets paved with marble, temples roofed in gold, storehouses bursting with grain. It was the heart of the world, and it believed itself untouchable. Alaric had tried patience. He had tried diplomacy. He had even tried threats. Each time Rome had delayed, bargained, and finally betrayed. The last betrayal had been at the port of Ravenna, where imperial soldiers massacred the families of his Gothic Federate troops. That massacre had sent the survivors flooding to his camp, their loyalty to Rome replaced with a hunger for vengeance. He had that vengeance now, shivering in the rain at his back. He crumpled the emperor's letter. The soft parchment gave way, the wax seal cracking. 8 years of patience dissolved in the grip of one hand. He was done waiting. He turned his face from the gate, toward the sea of expectant faces and glinting spear points in the mist. The debt would be paid. Not in imperial gold from Ravenna. It would be collected from the streets of Rome itself, and the world, which believed some things were unthinkable, was about to learn a new truth. Inside the Aurelian walls, the morning was dry and sharp with the smell of baking bread and sewage. The Senate house on the Forum was not full. Many of the old families had retreated to their country estates, sensing the chill in the air long before the first Visigoth scout was seen. But Priscus Attalus was there, a senator of the old blood. His toga was impeccably white, his posture a monument to a dying confidence. He rose to speak, his voice echoing in the half-empty chamber. The subject was the grain dole. It was late again. The warehouses at Ostia were full, but the ships weren't moving. The plebeians gathered outside the curia were restless, their murmurs a dull thunder against the marble. Attalus did not address their hunger. He addressed a myth. "They are beyond the walls," he said, his hand gesturing vaguely north, "a rabble in the rain. Let them shiver. Let them starve. They will look upon these stones and know their place." He spoke of the walls as if they were magical, 19 kilometers of brick and concrete that had not been breached in the lifetime of anyone's great-great-grandfather. 800 years of invincibility. In his mind, it was a law of nature. Rome did not fall. This was the arrogance of an institution that believes its past success guarantees its future safety. Attalus and the men who nodded along saw the Visigoths not as an army but as a temporary nuisance, a negotiating tactic gone awry. They debated the price of bread while Alaric calculated the price of betrayal. The real crisis, in their view, was not the army outside, but the insolence of the emperor's court in Ravenna. Honorius, the boy emperor, was a fool, and his minister Olympius a venomous schemer. Their refusal to pay the Goths was seen as a political blunder, not an existential threat. Let Ravenna's arrogance burn itself out, another senator muttered. The barbarian will tire, he always does. They missed the calculation entirely. This was not the old game of raid and retreat. Alaric had been inside the machine. He had commanded Roman troops, worn Roman insignia, and learned Roman logistics. He knew the city's strength and its sickness. He knew the grain supply was fragile. He knew the aqueducts ran for miles in the open, vulnerable as a stretched throat. He knew the city's garrison was a ghost of itself, filled with raw recruits and Germanic mercenaries whose loyalty was for sale. The walls were magnificent, but they were manned by shadows. Attalus concluded his speech to polite, distracted applause. The Senate moved to adjourn. The matter of the grain dole deferred to a committee. As he stepped out into the forum's pale sunlight, Attalus felt a familiar satisfaction. Order had been asserted, tradition had been invoked, the world in its proper Roman shape remained. He did not look toward the northern hills. He did not see the movement among the abandoned villas and overgrown orchards beyond the Tiber. Alaric's scouts were already there, men in dark wool and leather, moving with a hunter's patience through the skeletal vineyards. They were not testing the walls, not yet. They were counting the guard towers, noting the intervals between patrols, marking where the great brick circuit dipped into a valley or was shaded by a stand of ancient cypress. They were looking for the thing that all walls have, not a weakness of stone, but a weakness of mind. The city believed its own legend. It believed the sheer weight of its history was a shield. As Attalus's litter carried him up the Palatine Hill toward his insulated villa, he passed a line of sullen citizens waiting for bread that would not come. Their eyes held a different kind of knowledge, a raw animal understanding of emptiness. The myth of invincibility is a comfort only to the well-fed. That night in the cramped, fire-lit tent beyond the Porta Salaria, Alaric studied the scouts' reports. They spoke of quiet sectors, of guards huddled around braziers, of a great sprawling city that had forgotten the sound of a true alarm bell. He listened, his face unreadable. The debt was now a living thing growing in the dark. It would be paid in 3 days, and the first coin would be fear collected from the very men who had thought it unthinkable. The scouts returned just before dawn on December 24th. They brought no reports of troop movements or siege engines. They spoke of stone channels. Alaric listened, then gave a single order. His men moved not toward the walls, but away from them, following the high, arched spines of the aqueducts that stretched across the countryside like the vertebrae of a fallen giant. They carried no torches. Their tools were axes and heavy iron picks. They worked at the narrowest points, where the channels crossed deep gullies on slender arcades of brick. The first blows echoed dully in the winter dark. Then came the sound of cracking stone, a deep groan, and finally the roar of released water, a torrent of it, crashing down onto the frozen earth below. They did this at the Aqua Claudia. They did it at the Annio Novus. They did it at the Martia. One by one, the great arteries that fed the city were severed. Inside Rome, the day began normally. The public fountains in the forum's basins still burbled, the baths near the Campus Martius still filled. Then, around mid-morning, the flow from the Nymphaeum of Alexander slowed to a trickle. Then it stopped. The water in the great pool of the Lacus Uternae sank, revealing a lining of greenish silt and lost coins. By noon, every public fountain in the city was dry. The silence was profound. For 8 centuries, the sound of flowing water had been the background music of Roman life. Now it was gone. This was not an assault on the walls. It was an assault on the rhythm of civilization itself. Think of the moment, a utility you take for granted. Water, power, the very pulse of normalcy is cut off. The machinery of a city grinds to a halt. The baths closed. The laundries shut down. The bakeries, which needed water for their dough and their mills, shuttered their ovens. The reality, cold and simple, seeped into the public consciousness faster than any rumor of battle. The pipes were empty. The myth of infinite abundance was broken. Panic is a quiet thing at first. It is the sight of a woman staring into a dry basin, her water jar useless at her hip. It is the gathering of confused men at the sealed doors of the baths of Diocletian. By afternoon, the panic found its direction. The Tiber. A sluggish brown-green ribbon winding through the city's heart. The poor from the Subura and the Aventine descended the stone embankments, jars and buckets in hand. The river was the city's sewer, its repository for the waste of 1,000,000 souls and the offal of its slaughterhouses. It was also, now, the only water left. They fought for position on the slippery steps. They filled their vessels with water the color of mud. Some drank it immediately, gagging on the taste. Others, in their desperation, waded in too deep. The current near the Pons Aemilius was stronger than it looked, swollen with winter rain from upstream. The first body was seen floating past the Tiber island just before dusk, a man in a ragged tunic, his empty bucket bobbing beside him. More followed. They were not killed by swords, but by thirst and the frantic, ugly scramble for the only thing left to drink. By nightfall, the watchmen on the walls reported a new flotsam in the dark water, the corpses of the poor, drifting silently toward the sea. In the Senate House, the mood had curdled from arrogance into a cold, clammy fear. The debate was no longer about grain or imperial insults. It was about survival for the next week. A delegation was hastily formed. 2 senators of middling rank, their faces pale above their formal togas, were escorted through the Porta Salaria under a flag of truce. They were led to Alaric's tent, which was no longer a simple field shelter but a spacious command post warmed by a brazier, its ground covered with captured Anatolian carpets. The Goth received them standing. He did not offer them wine. He listened to their stammered pleas for mercy, for reason, for the memory of Rome's past greatness. He let them finish, then he handed one of them a wax tablet. On it was a list written in clear, unadorned Latin. The first senator read it aloud, his voice barely a whisper. 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, 4,000 tunics of silk, 3,000 pounds of pepper. The second senator stared, his mind struggling to comprehend the scale. This was not a demand for tribute. It was an invoice, a bill presented for services rendered and betrayed. It was the price of the Foedus Honorius had ripped up. It was the cost of... The senator's silence. Alaric finished the thought for him. It is the cost of leaving. The delegation returned through the gate. The tablet clutched like a dead weight. The Senate, faced with the numbers, did the only thing it could. It turned on its own. They ordered the pagan temples stripped. For centuries, Rome's gods had been placated with offerings. Now their statues were melted down for bullion. They seized the solid gold vessels from the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. They took the silver plates from the household shrines of the wealthy, who protested until soldiers appeared at their doors. It took 3 days. They raised the gold and the silver, the silk and the pepper. They delivered it to the Gothic camp. And then nothing happened. The gates remained shut. The Goths did not depart. Inside the city, the silence grew teeth. Bishop Innocent, I walked through the vast, hollow cavern of the baths of Diocletian at dusk. The great frigidarium pool was a dry, stained basin. Dust motes swam in the last slants of light falling through high windows. For generations, this place had been a roar of steam and laughter, the heartbeat of a people who believed water and marble were their birthright. Now, the only sound was the echo of his own sandals on the cracked mosaic floor, a man walking through the skeleton of an idea. He climbed to the city's northern rampart, near the Porta Nomentana. The watchman pointed, not at siege engines, but at the Gothic campfires flickering in the December dark. No rams were being built, no ladders assembled. The Visigoths were simply present, a ring of fire and quiet men. A rumor reached him, passed from a pallid sentry. The Goths were trading with desperate Romans at the river gates, selling bags of grain for their weight in gold jewelry, a woman's bracelet for a loaf of bread, a senator's signet ring for a skin of well water. Alaric was not stopping them. Innocent felt the truth settle in his gut, colder than the evening air. This was the revelation. Alaric wasn't trying to conquer Rome. He was letting Rome conquer itself. The physical siege was a pantomime. The real siege was psychological, and it had already been won the moment the aqueducts fell. The city was now a sealed jar, and inside it, fear and hunger were doing the work of any army. The dread of a threat that doesn't attack, but just waits for you to break down, is a more potent weapon than any battering ram. He looked from the dark, silent baths below to the pinpricks of enemy fires beyond the wall. The empire had not been defeated by a foreign sword, but by the slow internal collapse of its own myth. The walls still stood, 8 centuries strong, and yet Rome was already gone. It had vanished not in a clash of arms, but in the dry throat of a fountain, in the hollow echo of an empty bath, in the desperate trade of a family heirloom for a mouthful of food. The body still breathed, but the spirit had fled. The bishop descended the steps, a new and terrible understanding taking shape. This was not a war for territory. It was a lesson, and the city, starving and fractious in the dark behind him, was the pupil. He thought of Augustine, his correspondent in Hippo, who was beginning to write of 2 cities, one of man, one of God. As Innocent walked the shadowed street toward the Lateran, the boundary between those 2 cities felt terrifyingly thin. The very stones of Rome seemed to whisper that one of them was already finished. The gold arrived at his camp on the morning of January 3rd, 409. 5,000 pounds of it, plus 30,000 of silver, 4,000 silk tunics, and 3,000 pounds of pepper. It was not the original demand. It was more. The wagons creaked out of the Porta Salaria at dawn, their axles groaning under the literal weight of Rome's pride. The gold leaf peeled from the temple of Jupiter, the melted-down statues of winged victory, the emptied treasuries of 100 ancient cults. Alaric watched it come, his breath fogging in the cold air. He did not smile. He simply ordered it counted. Inside the city they called it a ransom, a payment for peace. The Senate, having stripped its gods bare, now waited behind the walls, listening. The sound they hoped to hear was the retreat of 40,000 Goths. What they heard by midday was the crack of whips and the lowing of oxen, not moving north, but circling to the south. Alaric was not leaving. He was repositioning. He took the treasure and moved his entire host to the port of Ostia, 23 miles down the Tiber. He seized the granaries. He controlled the river. Now, Rome's breadbasket belonged to the man it had just paid. Think about that move. It is the moment the transaction revealed itself. This was not a peace settlement. It was a demonstration. Alaric had just shown the Senate the precise price of their fear. He now knew exactly how much they would pay to make a problem go away. And everyone, from the poorest pleb to Bishop Innocent in his silent palace, understood the terrible modern parallel. You never pay off a bully. You only show him how much you're willing to pay. For a few weeks, a fragile, shameful normalcy returned. The gates reopened under guard. Some grain trickled in from Ostia at Gothic prices. The fountains remained dry, but the Tiber's foul water flowed. The Senate, and the Emperor's shadow regent in Ravenna, allowed themselves a desperate collective sigh. They had bought time. They had purchased safety. They were, of course, wrong. The treasure of Jupiter was not a solution. It was a down payment. Alaric had what he came for, not just gold, but proof. Proof that the heart of the empire was hollow, proof that its leaders would rather melt their history than fight for it. He had tested the walls and found them manned by ghosts. The real siege, the one of the spirit, was over. The next one would be different. It would not be a negotiation over gold. It would be a lesson written in fire. and the tuition was coming due. The lesson began in the summer of 41 Den. Alaric moved. He did not march on Rome. He marched past it, south into the rich, untouched grain lands of Campania. He was no longer a supplicant at the gate. He was a landlord collecting rent from his own estate. The Gothic cavalry swept through vineyards and villas, and the food that was supposed to feed Rome through the winter now fed the army besieging it. In Ravenna, Emperor Honorius, surrounded by marshes and palace intrigues, issued another decree. Alaric was to be declared an enemy of the state. It was a piece of paper thrown at a wildfire. Inside the city, the heat was of a different kind. The grain dole stopped. The water did not return. The wealth had been shipped out months ago. What remained was fear, and fear curdles into desperation. It found a voice in a senator named Priscus Attalus. The same man who had once declared the walls unbreachable now stood in the Senate and said the unthinkable: they should replace the emperor. They should negotiate with Alaric to make a new friendly emperor, one who would pay the Goths what they wanted and give them a home. It was a coup born of pure panic, and Alaric, the king without a kingdom, agreed. He crowned Attalus himself with a diadem of cheap gold. It was a farce performed with a sword at its back. The farce lasted 6 months. Attalus, playing emperor, failed to open the African grain ports. He failed to command loyalty. He failed, most importantly, to deliver what Alaric needed: a permanent legal settlement for his people within the empire. Alaric watched his puppet fumble, and his patience, that cold, immense patience that had held for 2 years, snapped. In the summer heat, he stripped the diadem from Attalus's head in a public ceremony. He sent the broken senator to Honorius as a gift. The message was not subtle: your nobles are toys. I am done playing. He turned back to Rome. Not for gold, not for a puppet, for the city itself. The Gothic army reformed around the Aurelian walls for the 3rd time, but this encirclement had a different texture. There were no shouted demands, no heralds. A terrible, focused quiet settled over the camps. The Visigoths were not besieging a fortress. They were waiting for a fruit to rot and fall inside. The silence was worse. The defenders on the walls were ghosts, slaves, the elderly, the starving. The legions were a memory. The great oak gates, each a ton of iron-bound timber, were held shut by bolts thicker than a man's arm. They had held for 8 centuries. Their strength was now their single point of failure. Which brings us to the hinge of history. The hour before dawn on August 24th, 410, a slave named Marcus stands watch at a small postern gate near the Portus Salaria. It is not a main gate, but a service entrance, a forgotten mouth in the miles of stone. His world is the chill of the nightstone under his palm and the hollow ache in his stomach. He is a body guarding a door for masters who have already fled or barricaded themselves in their palaces. He owns nothing, not even the next day. From the other side of the gate, a voice cuts the darkness. It does not shout. It speaks Latin, but with the hard, rolling accent of the north. It says his name: Marcus. How? Perhaps a whispered network of slaves inside and out. Perhaps a promise made weeks prior through the grate. The voice does not threaten. It offers freedom, gold, a full belly, a life. It paints the precise picture of everything Rome has just denied him. The catastrophic consequence of a single quiet betrayal by someone you thought was on your side is never a grand, dramatic choice. It is the simple, inevitable arithmetic of a man with nothing being offered something. The massive oak bolt, unseen for generations, groans as he lifts it. The sound is not loud. It is the deep wooden protest of a mechanism never meant to be used. The iron brackets shriek a little, shedding rust, then silence. He pulls. The gate swings inward, not with a crash, but with the soft, final sigh of wood on stone. No trumpets sound, no alarms are raised. For a moment there is only the open black rectangle of the gateway and the cool draft of the outside world flowing into the city. Then a shape fills it, a Visigoth warrior, his face pale in the starlight, his breath fogging. He steps across the threshold. His boot settles on the cobbles of the Via Salaria inside the wall. He does not rush. He looks at Marcus, gives a single nod, and moves aside. Another follows, then another. A silent, relentless file, flowing into the heart of the empire like water into a crack. They do not yell, they do not charge, they walk. For the first time in 800 years, an enemy army walks into Rome unopposed. The gate is open, the lesson is beginning, and the tuition, as promised, will be paid in fire. Dawn arrived not with a trumpet blast, but with a low gray light that seeped into the city through its new open wound. Alaric walked through the Porta Salaria, his boots scuffing the same cobbles where imperial triumphs had once paraded. He did not look like a conqueror savoring a moment. He looked like a foreman arriving at a work site. He gathered his chieftains not in the forum, but in the shadow of the gate itself. His orders were specific, delivered in a calm, flat tone. 3 days. That was the limit. They would have 3 days to take what they had been promised for a decade. But there were rules. The churches of the apostles Peter and Paul, their great basilicas outside the walls, were to be untouched, sanctuary. Everything else was inventory. His warriors fanned out not as a riotous horde, but as methodical looters. They moved in small, efficient bands, each with a specific target. They knew exactly where the senatorial palaces were clustered on the Palatine and Aventine hills. This was not random violence. It was a repossession for 2 years. They had studied the city from the outside, noting which villas had the most slaves, which doors were the most ornate. Now they simply walked up to them. The sound that filled Rome that first morning was not the scream of battles, but the systematic crack of locks breaking. The splinter of cedarwood doors giving way to axes, the scrape of bronze statues, gods, emperors, forgotten ancestors being dragged across marble floors. You could hear the thud of heavy chests hitting the ground, the metallic chime of silver plate being piled into sacks woven from military tents. Inside the palaces, the violation was intimate, almost quiet. A Visigoth would stand in a sunlit atrium, his eyes adjusting from the gloom of a northern forest to the brilliant mosaics underfoot. He would run a calloused hand over a silk curtain, feeling a texture he had no name for. He would pocket a carved ivory hairpin, a silver spoon, a glass vial of perfume. It was the eerie quiet of a burglary in progress, amplified to a citywide scale. The owners were either hiding in inner rooms or had already fled to their country estates, believing the walls would hold. They had left their world behind, and now that world was being itemized and carried away, piece by piece. Alaric himself took up residence in the old palace of the Caesars on the Palatine. He did not sit on a throne. He stood at a window watching the plumes of smoke begin to rise, not from fires of destruction, but from the countless small cook-fires of his army making breakfast in the heart of the empire. His face showed no triumph, only a profound, weary calculation. The gold was expected. The silk was a curiosity, but the real prize, the one he was still waiting for, was more elusive. He needed a symbol, a gesture from the empire itself that would make this looting not a crime, but a transaction. Down in the Forum, a group of Goths found the doors to the treasury in the Temple of Saturn barred. Instead of burning them, they brought up a heavy iron battering ram taken from a city gatehouse. They used Rome's own defenses against its heart. On the third swing, the bronze doors buckled inward with a groan that echoed across the empty square. And in a villa on the Caelian hill, a young priest named Augustine, who had watched the Gothic camps from the walls for months, heard the distant rhythmic crashes. He put down his pen, the letter to his flock half finished. The theoretical had just become concrete. The city of man was falling. He would soon begin writing the only answer he had left, the blueprint for a city of God. but that was for later. For now there was only the sound of breaking, and the cold understanding that an era had ended not with a war but with a wholesale, quiet theft. Gunderic, a Visigoth warrior whose name meant War Council, found himself in a senator's library on the afternoon of the second day. He was not looking for knowledge, he was looking for a dry place to cook his pork. The room was long and narrow, lined with wooden cabinets whose pigeonholes were stuffed tight with scrolls. Light fell in dusty shafts from high windows, illuminating 1,000 cylinders of papyrus and vellum, each bound with a faded silk cord. Gunderic ran a finger along one, feeling the strange, dry texture. He could not read the label, written in a precise, curling Latin hand, Ab urbe condita libri, Livy. He shrugged. He had marched for 10 years, from the Danube to the Peloponnese to these 7 hills, for gold and food and land, not for words. He gathered an armful of the scrolls, their cases cracking, and dumped them in the center of the intricate mosaic floor. He used his flint and steel, sparking a tiny flame onto the dry papyrus. It caught slowly then, with a soft, eager rush. The history of Rome, from its mythic founding by Romulus to its recent shivering decline, began to curl and blacken. He fed the fire steadily, using scrolls as kindling. Tacitus's grim chronicles of imperial corruption burned beside poetic odes. Legal commentaries smoked and withered. Gunderic turned his pork on a spit over the flames, the fat dripping down with a hiss, the grease soaking into ash that had once been a census of Gaul. He watched the strange symbols blacken and vanish. There was no malice in the act. It was pure, efficient indifference. The parchment burned hot and clean. It was better than damp firewood. Think of that for a moment. Watching something of immense, fragile cultural value, a book, a painting, a recording be destroyed not out of hatred, but out of sheer practical disregard. The value was invisible to him. It was just fuel. By evening, the library was a gutted shell, the air thick with a sweet, acrid smoke. Gunderic left, his belly full, the mosaic floor beneath him a cracked and soot-stained ruin. His fire was not unique. All across Rome, in 1,000 looted palaces and villas, similar fires burned. Warriors used painted portraits for kindling, tax records to warm their hands, epic poems to light their pipes. As the sun set on the second day, a new kind of smoke began to hang over the city. It was a greasy, clinging pall that dimmed the twilight, a haze that smelled of burning pork and something sharper, more ancient, the scent of incinerated memory. It was the smell of burning papyrus. On the third morning, they found the tomb. It stood across the river, a massive cylindrical fortress of white marble atop a square base, the mausoleum of Hadrian. To the Visigoths, it was just another large building, perhaps a treasury. They broke through the bronze doors with axes, the sound echoing in the vast circular chamber within. They were not met with chests of coin or jeweled scepters. They found silence and dust, and a single colossal object at the heart of the monument, a huge porphyry urn, dark red as clotted blood, containing the ashes of the Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian, the traveler, the builder, the restless soul who had walked the edges of his own empire. He had fortified Britain with a wall, rebuilt Jerusalem, and left a legacy in stone across 3 continents. Now, his final resting place was breached by men whose grandfathers had lived beyond the Danube he had once patrolled. A warrior named Thorismund, tasked with watering the chieftain's horses, looked at the great urn. It was solid stone, taller than a man, beautifully carved with garlands and eagles. He saw its perfect hollow center. He gave an order. They tipped the massive thing. The imperial ashes, fine as gray sand, poured out in a silent cloud, settling across the marble floor. The urn, now empty, was rolled with immense effort, scraping a deep gouge in the stone out into the morning light. They set it upright in the courtyard. Thorismund's men began filling it with bucket after bucket of Tiber water. Think about that act. The profound disrespect of using a sacred monument for something utterly mundane, stripping it of all meaning. This was not the rage of a revolutionary or the zeal of an iconoclast. It was simpler, and in its way more final. The tomb was not a tomb, it was a convenient stone basin. The ashes of Rome's great builder were just dust to be swept aside by the wind coming off the river. As the horses drank from the imperial urn, the systematic looting across the Tiber reached its end. The wagons in the Forum Boarium were piled impossibly high: silver mirrors, silk gowns, sacks of pepper and grain, bronze statues bent from their pedestals. The Visigoths did not torch the city, they did not slaughter the remaining populace. They simply took every movable thing of value and prepared to leave. By late afternoon on that third day, a strange quiet descended. The shouts of the looters faded. The creak of wagon wheels grew sporadic, then ceased. The smoke from 1,000 careless fires thinned to a pale haze as the sun set, casting long shadows from the broken aqueducts. The Visigoth host began to move south, a slow river of people and carts leaving through the Porta Appia. They left behind a city that was physically largely intact. The walls still stood. The churches of St. Peter and St. Paul were untouched, as Alaric had ordered. The great public buildings, the Curia, the Basilicas, still dominated the forums, but the city was spiritually hollowed out. Its gold was gone, its grain was gone. The tangible proof of its 1,000-year accumulation of wealth now rolled away on Gothic carts. What remained was a shell, haunted by the ghost of its own permanence, the bitter taste of ashes in the air. The world had been unmade, not with fire and slaughter, but with cold, methodical taking, and the silence they left behind was louder than any scream. The news traveled slowly, carried by refugees on leaking ships and merchants with haunted eyes. It took weeks to cross the sea. When it finally reached the North African port of Hippo, it landed like a physical weight. A bishop named Augustine, a man who had once lived in Rome's dizzying intellectual circles, received the letters. They described not flames, but emptiness, the theft of a city's soul. Augustine sat at a simple wooden desk in his study. The afternoon light, thick with African dust, fell across the parchment. He dipped his pen. He did not begin a lament. He started a defense. His treatise would be called The City of God. It was born not from abstract theology, but from that specific hollowing silence following a disaster. It was the moment you stop asking, "Why us?" and start building a new philosophy from the rubble. He wrote that Rome had confused itself with eternity. Its marble and legions were merely the grandest of earthly things, and all earthly things must pass. The true city, he argued, was not made of stone, but of souls bound by faith. It could not be sacked because it had no gates for Alaric to breach. This was the ultimate rebuttal to the ashes in Hadrian's mausoleum. Think about that pivot. An empire falls, and a man in a small room uses it to redraw the boundaries of the world. He shifted the center of gravity from the forum to the human heart. The fall of Rome was not the end of the world. It was the end of an idea, the dangerous, beautiful idea that any city of man could last forever. Augustine's words would outlive the empire that made him, providing the blueprint for a world where power was no longer measured in gold or granite, but in something the Goths could never cart away. The silence after Rome was not an ending. It was the space where a new world began to whisper. Today, the Porta Salaria is a traffic circle. Buses and scooters roar through the gap where the gate once stood. Most drivers have no idea what happened there on an August morning 16 centuries ago. They are thinking about being late for work, not about a slave lifting an oak bolt in the pre-dawn dark. The stones are gone. The memory is not. You can stand on the curb, feel the diesel exhaust, and be precisely where the world changed. The pavement covers the ruts from the wagons that carried away Rome's gilded pride. The echo of that moment is in the ordinary rush hour, a civilization's end point turned into a commute. The end of something forever changes what comes after, even if the people who live there forget why. Augustine's city of God was built from that forgetting. He knew empires are not erased. They are paved over. Their weight settles into the foundation of whatever comes next, invisible but essential, like the bedrock beneath the asphalt. So the story doesn't end with Alaric riding away. It ends here in the unmarked present. Driving through an ordinary intersection, completely unaware that it was once the epicenter of a historical catastrophe, the silence after Rome was never empty. It was just waiting for the noise of the next world to fill it.